It's time again for the Insiders with Chuck Chvala and Scott Jensen, sponsored by the Wisconsin Counties Association and the Tommy G. Thompson Center on Public Leadership.
Hi, I'm Chuck Chvala, former Senate Majority Leader.
And I'm Scott Jensen, former Assembly Speaker.
We're the Insiders. So, Scott, control of the Wisconsin Supreme Court, ideologically and otherwise, is up this spring in the April election. And it's an interesting match. Brad Schimel and Susan Crawford. Obviously, they come as have the candidates now for the last probably 6 or 7 elections, very, very finely tuned as to which party they're staying with. What do you think is going to happen? What do you see developing, and where do you think the election will end up?
Well, the one thing everyone can agree on is an extraordinary amount of money is going to be spent on these elections because it determines so much regarding the future of the state of Wisconsin. And if you believe Susan Crawford, it even determines the future of Congress because she's apparently willing to redistrict the congressional seats to give 2 more seats to the Democrats. I think if you look at the race here, it started out where you expected the candidates to start out with Crawford hitting Schimel on abortion and on his record on rape kits in the time in which he was Attorney General of the state of Wisconsin. And Schimel started out with all of his law enforcement endorsements. But I think the race is now that I believe right now that Schimel is beginning to get traction against Crawford on a number of issues. She has some explaining to do with regards to a number of criminal cases she handled with sexual predators and violent offenders who let off with really light sentences, just hard to explain sentences in a number of those cases. Plus, then you go on, she's against voter ID, which is a 75–80% issue in Wisconsin. She was against Act 10. She's out there talking about other liberal issues. I think that is problematic for her. But again, that's so far what we've seen is the scrapping between the 2 candidates and not the incredible amount of money that will be coming in from independent expenditures, which could easily reshape the race that the 2 candidates wanted to have over this seat, and it could go in either direction.
Well, Scott knows as well as I do, nobody's voting on this election on voter ID. And Scott is right that there's been a lot of back and forth about issues related to criminals and what's happened. Brad Schimel has even been accused of taking money and then giving a lighter sentence to someone. And I was surprised even to see that allegation. But I think what's happening here is both parties are basically coming to a draw on. They both have a problem with letting people off or doing something that that people from the outside, if they just take the text of that ad, would say, "Ooh, that doesn't sound good." But I think they fight to a draw on that issue. And I do think that the big issue again this spring, because it is directly in the hands of the Supreme Court, is abortion. And Schimel has some statements out there that are pretty extreme, where he has said, yeah, no, abortion, I'm pro-life, 100% pro-life, and all of these things. He's clearly a pro-life candidate. And if he wins, that tips the majority, and it means Wisconsin abortion law goes back to 1849. No one wants that. I don't think that you've seen the last of the Crawford or outside ads that are going to come in on this issue. And by the way, I think that will be the determining issue. I don't think that people care a lot about this. And by the way, on the congressional seats, again, nobody's voting on that issue. But how does a 50-50 state like Wisconsin end up with 6 Republicans and 2 Democrats? Nobody's going to look at that if they did and say, oh, that would be so unfair if we had 4 Democrats and 4 Republicans. And you know why we have it? Because the Republicans control everything and try to put through a situation where they'll have congressional districts that favor them. I mean, you can't write more than 6 Republican seats into existence. They managed to do it. So I do expect that this will impact the future of our congressional delegation, but nobody's voting on that. Nobody's voting on voter ID. Nobody's voting on who's worse or better with regard to letting criminals go free because they fight to a draw on that. I think at the end of the day, what comes through for people is, okay, do you want abortion to be legal in Wisconsin or not? It's a simple question, and it's a really simple answer. This is a case where this single election will determine whether or not abortion is legal in Wisconsin. I don't think the women of Wisconsin are going to let Brad Schimel get away with this. And by the way, the lower turnout that we have means suburban Milwaukee will have, the suburbs around Milwaukee will have a lot to say. Guess who's going to be voting there? Women. Guess how they're going to be voting on this issue? They're in favor of keeping abortion safe and legal and let women decide. I know I've been a one-note pony on this for a long time, but the reality is I think this will be the determining factor in this election in particular.
So I think you're right. The Democratic strategy is going to be to focus on abortion and try to make this election a referendum on abortion. But I think that if you look at the polling and you look at electoral results, that issue has peaked. The Democrats have gotten everything they were going to get out of that issue. They've gotten the voters that they were going to get, and they lost the presidential race in Wisconsin. The Assembly hung on to seats. They did well in the state Senate, and they won a U.S. state Senate race, a United States Senate race. But if you look at the polling, that issue during last fall peaked like the first week of October, and the Dems kept talking about it, and they did not gain any voters after that in any of the polling that we were looking at, because they marshaled those people early on, and they weren't going to get any more folks. I think the same thing is happening here. Everyone who has a position on abortion knows which way they're voting on the Supreme Court race. What is left is the people for whom that is not a big issue. That's a fair amount of people who might think crime is more important than the issue of abortion. It might be other issues that people come forward on, or the character of a judge, law enforcement endorsements, all those sort of things. I think that the piece that's yet to be determined is who wins the folks who haven't made up their mind that they're going to vote based upon the subject of abortion. And that's a fair number of people in this race. So we'll see. There's going to be an awful lot of money spent on it. They're going to bring up a lot of different issues. I think, sadly, we will see some charges against both candidates that will make people like you and me wince, like, ooh, that doesn't look like a judicial race to me. That doesn't even seem quite fair, given the facts of the case. But people are desperate for power. And all that money that people are bringing in from out of state to influence this election has a lot to do with people who want to influence the direction of this court and also the direction of this nation.
I think Scott's analysis of the fall election is correct as to when abortion peaked, and I thought it would be a bigger factor, and it was not at the end. It was other things, and it was definitely pocketbook, et cetera. The problem with that analysis is it doesn't apply to the spring election. This is a much different election. This is a much, much, much smaller electorate that will make the decision. And the other thing is, the one thing that the Supreme Court can do here in Wisconsin is determine whether abortion will be legal or not. That's the one thing that will change. The rest of this is gobbledygook. And I think they're going to fight to a draw basically on this: who's got more character, who has less, who's treating criminals poorly, and who isn't treating, those things will be fought to a draw. But the one thing that people will understand, they'll say, look, at the Supreme Court doesn't determine whether prices go up at the gas station. Well, what do they determine? They do determine whether a woman's right to choose will be done. You take the nature of this electorate, much smaller, and I believe more women, and suburban Milwaukee and Dane County will have a much bigger share of the electorate here than they do otherwise. Let's take a look at that after the election. And the fact that this race determines whether or not abortion is legal, I think that gives you your answer. And I believe Democrats will frame it that way before the end. And I think that will be the determining factor. And even though there are undecideds out there, undecideds are undecided for a whole range of reasons, as Scott and I both know. And what will happen is, as this gets bandied about, and there will be discussions, not just us, but of course, all sorts of other more vocal people out there, people are going to understand this race, it's about abortion. Where are we going to come down on that? We know which side each candidate is on. Where do we want to be? I think I know the answer to that question for this electorate this spring.
Well, we will see if once again they can play that card and win.
We'll see you next time.
You've been listening to The Insiders with Chuck Chvala and Scott Jensen, sponsored by the Wisconsin Counties Association and the Tommy G. Thompson Center on Public Leadership.